Welcome back, everyone. Today we're talking about Beethoven and the infamous Easy Sonata, Opus 49, number 2 in G major. This was a request from my Key Learners Piano Club by a member named George, who is learning the sonata and simply wanted tips on how to tackle it. So I figured the best way to do this is just to do basically a full-length tutorial as well as cut it into 14 mini sections of different aspects and ways to look at this piece. So without further ado, section 1 is the art of simplicity, as I would call it, and why this sonata actually matters, because it's often overlooked by intermediate and advanced players, and sometimes beginners don't try it because they think it's too hard. I think both are wrong. I think beginners should try it to push themselves, and professionals should try it to see how much beauty they can mine out of even simple notes. See, simplicity is important because just because it's easy doesn't mean there's no depth there underneath the surface. And this is a more sophisticated sonata than it appears on the surface. It's a few things make it this way. It has elements that all the other sonatas have. For example, arpeggiated chords, turns, good phrase structure with big entrances, melodies that are beautiful, even counterpoint, not just accompaniment, but actual melodies, where both hands are equally important. You get trill practice within the context of a melody, and you get all sorts of other things like melodic scales and fun, beautiful lines. And even practice with repeated notes not sounding static. I mean, that's not very interesting, right? But that little bit of bloom in the melody is very important. So the second section is just to look at the opening of the piece and to see how simple it really is, but also how elegant the crafting is. First, we get Mr. Beethoven announcing himself. Now, yes, there are a few sonatas that do this, like the last one. There's actually not that many that just start with a big loud chord. So that already is establishing his authority. Then we get a very interesting flourish up and down, a melody that has a very clear peak, and a very clear dip to the phrase. There's so much expression to be found in just this one phrase by shaping and by understanding the role of the left hand, as well as keeping this little accompaniment kind of exciting and not letting it fall flat. Like, it really has to keep the energy going, even though the energy is not necessarily shown in the sheet music. Beethoven is relying on your ability to study it and make interpretive decisions. Then he immediately repeats the phrase an octave higher, giving you the challenge of a beautiful top part of the piano and really controlling the left-hand thumb, so it's not... That's quite annoying. The tension of this opening is that you have to be both restrained as well as musically free. So the third section of this video is how to sculpt a melody without sounding robotic. And basically, the principle is that one phrase has one peak, and the last note is the quietest. Now, sometimes we break that rule. But if I take, for example, the next phrase after the one I just played. Now, this is the beginning. It kind of ends there. Well, what do we get? We get basically going up to this A minor, maybe a little more. Right here, there's the peak, and we're already coming down. Right? So if you just follow that one rule, you're already going to get so much closer to an end result. The other thing you want to think about here is the vocal inspiration. If you can even try to sing this melody or hum it, you'll run out of notes, of course. But even trying to do so gives you a more warm approach than just thumping through scales. You know, pianists really have it too easy sometimes by just hitting the keys and creating no sense of real warmth. You can't sing like that. Dee, 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 dee. That would actually hurt your throat, but it doesn't really hurt your hands. So a lot of people play this stuff without very much expression. The fourth section is all about balance and how do we keep our left hand quieter, but also at times give it a little bit of sparkle that it deserves. For example, in the third and fourth line, we have these triplets coming in, which if you play them loud, they're definitely going to get in the way. We certainly don't want that. At the same time, if they're too even and too quiet, it also kind of lacks energy. So sometimes I think we have to understand the pulse is there. Without really accenting it, we have to sort of give it a little nudge. Definitely the downbeat, beat 3 a little bit. Well, it's in cut time, which we haven't even discovered. So beat 1 and beat 2, if you know how cut time works. In other words, every 6 notes of the left hand will have a slight pulse. And this is how we can give it both energy, but still keep it out of the way. Now, to practice this, I would play 1 long, and the other 5 staccato. So long, long, short, 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 long, short, short, short. Now, this is just for practice, not when I'm actually learning it or performing it, only when I'm performing it. But I do this for practice because it teaches me to hear that note in isolation without having to slam it out. Now, when I play them all smooth, there's just a little bit of punctuation there. There's many other places in the left hand where we want to give partial attention, but not totally. For example, measure 21, we want the counter line to come out, but not the thumb, just as I mentioned earlier. So there's sort of a duet, and the thumb is quiet. This is just one of 20 examples I could show you in the left hand where there's actually more importance than it may look on the surface. Part 5, and one of the more underlooked aspects, is how harmony works in the classical period. And what we're looking for is any note that doesn't belong in the key of G major. If you know your G major scale, it has F sharp. So anytime we get a D sharp, a C sharp, or something else, that's Beethoven warning you that we're kind of leaving the key of G, at least temporarily, to kind of highlight something else. Couple great examples. Measure 3 already has an F natural. And that F natural is pulling us towards a different area that then resolves back to G. Now we get another example of this in measure 8 with the chromaticism right here. There's this tension of that D sharp arrival, and then again the C sharp. Now, would I stretch it that much? Most likely not, but being aware of it can imply some rubato, a little bit. Or at least a little kind of slur off dynamic. And being aware of these harmonies is a huge part of how we interpret the style, where we take time, where we might add a little touch of pedal, and those sorts of decisions. For part 6, I want to talk about fingering choices. Now, of course, for a work of this length, the fingering is not really that doable to address in 1 or 2 minutes. But what I would say is we want to think about the phrase structure that the fingering supports, not just what feels good on these notes, but what gives the natural stress points of the phrase. So, on the same example I just played, measure 9 with that little slur, I actually come up to 3 and 5 because I could do 4-5, but the 3-5 gives me a natural stress on the slur. And the 5 is weaker, so that naturally gives me kind of a slur off feel. Thumb under, 3-5, and again, it's more intuitive to do 4-5, but I don't get a good slur out of the 4. So 3-5, and so on and so forth. So the thing you want to think about is how does my fingering help me to play more warmly, Or at times, if I want a very kind of withdrawn sound that's still energetic, like in the development section, I will alternate 1 and 2 and have a very pokey bird beak-like fingering. You can't see it from a distance, but I'm literally going 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, and just staying really close to the key. Which is part of that drama of Beethoven, is actually holding it in so carefully that it doesn't go anywhere. There's times it does go somewhere, and then there's the moment like that that you have to hold so still to build the anticipation of what's going to come. Part 7 is the importance of knowing the structure and how to memorize this. So if you're not familiar with sonata form, there's other videos for that you should watch first. I'm going to assume you do know that, and that's the exposition comes first. There's a development in the middle that plays with the ideas, and the recapitulation. I always learn the exposition and the recapitulation back to back. So you play, for example, maybe just 2 measures. And then you go to the recapitulation the second time and you see, how is this one different from the first time? Other than the fact that I played a different note on accident, there is no difference. So then you keep kind of comparing and contrasting a couple measures at a time. And you go, second time. Only to find out that it's actually the same still. So what you're actually looking for is where does it change, and when it does, what specifically is different? Different octave, different fingering, different key center. The scale is, starting here instead of up here. There's often very subtle differences, and then the themes are the same, but the details are not. And noticing this right at the early parts of the learning process is very important. So learn the piece out of order so that you see these connections right away. The 8th part of this video is really dependent on what I just said about the whole sonata form thing. Even if you don't know that structure, this is a great entry point for understanding it. Because, again, you can learn that in a different video, but this piece is short and each theme is very brief, so you can very clearly understand theme 1 and theme 2 with a little transition in between them. Then the development takes all of those ideas and really plays around with it. In my opinion, for how few notes there are, he really builds the drama, bringing you right back to the main theme, the exposition, and the recap. So. It's like he makes that so inevitable to come back and so fulfilling when you get it the second time. So, learn this as a great example of sonata form to confirm what you do and don't know about it. Okay, so for the 9th part of the video, we have to talk about articulation. Now, this is something that's often neglected in beginner pianists. And of course, advanced pianists know this, but that's when they ignore such a piece. So what we have to think about is the fact that it's not just legato and staccato that's connected or not connected. There is such a thing as sort of a partial legato or partial staccato. And Beethoven is very clear at times here, legato phrasing, but then he doesn't put it in the next measure. He must then mean that one measure is slightly articulated, like the first one, with a little bit of clarity, and then immediately following we have something more warm. Not only legato, but perhaps even overlapping. Legatissimo, right? Like a cello line connecting everything. But then we get maybe almost fully staccato to bridge the gap and heighten the energy. There's a lot of scales in this piece that don't write anything at all, and perhaps those would be better off being a little bit more crispy. Though, some people play them with great success smoothly as well. Which one's right, which one's wrong? Frankly, I believe it's up to you. The classical articulation tends to be a little bit on the cleaner side, historically speaking. But at the end of the day, whatever is most beautiful wins. If you're convicted by it, then you will sell it to your audience. Now, for the 10th part of this video, we have to talk a little bit about the second movement, though the first is definitely the focus. It's unusual in that it's a 2-movement sonata, which it's typical to have 3, or even 4 in Beethoven's time. However, this minuet of a second movement is still a slow movement, if you will, or a lighter movement in nature, but not necessarily andante or largo as we may expect in a second movement. Instead, he just gives you kind of a toss-off minuet with a very simple tune. Which, that got stuck in my head for like months when I first heard this as a kid. It's very catchy and it's very charming. And actually, I think of all the lighter movements, this is easily up there with any Haydn piano sonata, my opinion. And in regards to the contrast, I think it's really important to take the first movement just fast enough that it's faster than the second. He says allegro, ma non troppo, so but not too fast. We're also, though, supposed to hear it in 2. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And that's interesting because the second movement is in 3, but kind of has this not too rhythmic feeling, but group gestures of 2, like here and there, pause, here and there, pause. And if that is faster than the first movement, I think we lose the proportion of the 2. So, very important to have a sort of stately quality and not rush in this second movement so we get the proper contrast. For the 11th part of this video, I really want to talk about the need for pedaling, because many people argue that in early Beethoven, we are not supposed to pedal. Now, if you know this sonata, it's Opus 49. This is actually in Beethoven's middle period, right around the Waldstein Sonata is the next one, which is definitely not an early sonata. The problem is, he wrote it long before that, and it really doesn't count as a middle period sonata. It was written probably around 1795, and his middle period was truly after the 1800s, at least 1801. So this has a much lighter feel to it. It has a sort of Mozart, Haydn-like clarity and charm that would suggest a little less pedal. Even with that, it's still warm, it's melodic, and it's musical. And playing the piano without the pedal is like trying to sing without the throat. I mean, like you do need a little bit of warmth behind everything. I would never play this sonata without pedal. That said, the things that don't lend themselves to pedal well are chromatic scales. Certainly we can't do that. Or actual scales, which there are plenty of. That's not at all the effect. In fact, Beethoven's clear there to write a rest on the second measure, or the second beat. Off, right there. And here I would not just soak the whole pedal for the whole measure, even though it's the same chord. Because it's not just the harmony that we would need to have clean, it's the clarity of the texture as well. And even though the harmony isn't changing, this gets the wrong effect. So you want to hear the beat and the pulse and the clarity no matter what pedaling you use. So I actually use pedal there, but I change it on every quarter note to get that clarity. Another great example of the pedaling here would be there. I don't necessarily change it on exact notes, but I simply just kind of flutter it freely the whole time. Because I want a warmth in that scale, but I don't want it to be wet. Part 12 is all about the development and how much Beethoven really packs into these very few measures. Now, again, if you don't know sonata form, not a problem. I think a lot of this will still make sense to you regardless. If you're watching this, you're at least familiar with the piece. So, measure 53, we get this big jarring chord right away, which is clearly referencing the opening. Right? But he takes it a different direction. This very like aggressive downward scale going into a minor key. Which all of a sudden is completely different. We haven't had a true minor sound in the piece yet. There's been minor chords, but there hasn't been a frown on the face, so to speak. So he's going to a whole new extreme. And it's right on the heels of D major, where you left a smile, and then And then this angry triplet coming up. Where does this come from? Quite interesting. This. It's the melody from the first measure that has now become the accompaniment in measure 57. A new key. And of course, you're getting a blend of the second theme and the first theme here that's now become a new theme entirely. Quite fascinating. Now, he goes to a B major chord, which is kind of surprising and kind of not, because he's functioning this as the dominant chord, or the 5, of the relative minor. So if you know a little bit of theory, G major is related to E minor. The 5 of that is B7. So he's really just setting you up to get to this highly dramatic return. The interesting thing for me is he actually doesn't really go to E minor. Right there, he does, for one single quarter note. And we're immediately back to A minor, which becomes D7. So this is typical Beethoven, where he makes you think he's going to go somewhere, he challenges your expectation, and he immediately takes you somewhere else, only to bring you back to where he started. All the core ingredients of what he does in the more advanced sonatas are right here. As simple as that little passage is. I'm going to play it just for fun, because you really just have to take this development in one go. So with a little bit of context. Back right to the smile on the face, the sun comes out, and everything. It's quite fascinating. So part 13 here, a little bit more on the second movement of this sonata. I think it's really important to play both of the movements. I have seen quite a few students approach it and only learn the first, but frankly, the second is not any harder. In fact, there's some things about it that are much easier than the first movement. And I just think it's terribly important to play them as a set because, first of all, it's really unique that he does only 2 movements. And second, he really seems to imply this sort of continuation. The first ends right here, setting you up in the same key. And it's actually not terribly unusual he does this, but it ends with F sharp G in the first movement. And then the second begins with G, F sharp, backwards. So I kind of find this little connection there. Normally, the second movement is in a different key. Though in 2-movement sonatas, that's not as common because you have both starting and ending in the same key. So admittedly, that one's a bit of a stretch. But even so, I really recommend playing them together. And it's really just so charming to kind of have this semi-heroic first movement, calming down, and then really gaining its energy again by the end with a reflection back to the first movement in some of the scales and figurations. Like even right there, that minor is coming from the development of the first movement. Kind of the same feeling. Change. And you think, oh, he's just throwing it away. And then he's like, no, I've saved all my best tricks for last. And you know what's so cool about all of this figurations is they actually look back to the opening measures of the first movement in this almost memory, like, oh, we were just there a couple minutes ago. You know, we just kind of took it a different direction. And then As simple as it could be. The exact same opening as the first movement, sorry, closing, except we went from loud and spread apart to quiet and close together. Quite charming. So, part 14, the last part of this video, is going to be just some performance advice on Beethoven in general. Though this sonata in particular is quite light, I do believe Beethoven is all about contrast. The thing I would focus on the most is how can I surprise my audience and not make it too predictable. So for example, you can show this by being very calm in your body posture, even keep the hands in the lap, take a big sniff like a conductor does before leading their orchestra. Like how shocking to just like see this calm performer and then all of a sudden this big chord, right? And then immediately you don't want a heavy and driven gesture, but instead almost apologizing, right? And then singing. See, so already there's 3 moods. There's shock you, apologize, and then share your heart. And frankly, that doesn't change throughout the entire piece. There's this kind of humorous singing, and then more of a tender reflection. So throughout the whole sonata, we must be very careful to not play it too bland, but to bring these great contrasts. Now, it's not as much of a contrast as, let's say, the Appassionata. You know, with these huge outbursts. Of course, you have to play with the texture of what Beethoven gives you, but given that, there's very clear moments to come out and keep quiet and then share your heart. So, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to learn more, simply look in the description below. You're going to find a free piano guide, as well as my Key Learners Piano Club, where we talk about things like this all the time: musical style, performance tips, technique, and how to actually improve the quality of our playing from the ground up. You can get a free trial by just visiting the About page in the description. Talk to you soon.